One giant leap for mankind.
It is October 4, 1957. The Russians have launched the world's first satellite and man-made object into space. Thus, the Cold War makes a dramatic entrance into the unknown. The Cold War, also called the Atomic Age, began in 1949 when the Soviets started another dispute with the U.S. by testing the first atomic bomb. In response, President Truman of the U.S. announced that they, too, would build the most destructive atomic weapon in history. Of course, that kicked off the deadly arms race against Communist Russia and conservative America. This arms race led to both nations deciding to expand into space. The Soviet Union took the lead and constructed an artificial satellite named Sputnik, meaning traveler in Russian, and successfully sent it off into space. Then the U.S. decided to respond in 1958 by launching their own satellite, Explorer 1. After that, they prompted President Eisenhower to create NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. These creations were just the beginning of a major dispute between who would win over the space race, the Soviets or the United States. Although World War II technically ended in 1945, tensions were still high between countries for years to come.
We had hoped that our wartime ally, the Soviet Union, would join in the efforts of the whole community of nations to build a peaceful world. Instead, the Soviet leaders have been an obstacle to peace.
Both superpowers tried to demonstrate that there was a superior land by having the best technology and military. One of the most significant competitions between the two nations was the race for a new frontier, space. During the mid-1950s, the Cold War had woven its way into everyday life. The Cold War was fueled by an arms race, a threat of nuclear weapons, the Korean War, and a clash of ideas, and the space race. Although the space race had been going on for a while, the first major event occurred on October 4, 1957, when Russia successfully launched Sputnik, the first human-made object to be put into Earth's orbit and the first artificial satellite. Although the Soviet Union celebrated the success of Sputnik, and it was a major shock to most Americans and not a pleasant one.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this Earth. Suddenly, it has become as much a part of 20th century life as the whir of your vacuum cleaner. It's a report from man's farthest frontier, the radio signal transmitted by the Soviet Sputnik, the first man-made satellite as it passed over New York earlier today.
Well, Dr. Newell, what about the vital question that everybody is thinking about? Why and how did the Russians beat us to the draw?
The sheer power of Sputnik terrified many Americans, and they believed that this technology would make it possible for the Soviets to attack the U.S. with a nuclear warhead. This helped create a more urgent push to gather information about the Soviets, their technologies, and their military activity. In response to Sputnik, the U.S. launched their own satellite, Explorer 1, in 1958. This satellite was designed by the U.S. Army and the rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. President Dwight Eisenhower also signed a public order in 1958 that created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration.
I shall propose a program of action, a program that will demand the energetic support of not just the government, but every American, if we are to make it successful.
In addition to establishing NASA, Eisenhower additionally created two other national space programs that dealt with security.
Our defenses must be adequate, not just today, but tomorrow and in all the years to come.
The first program was run by the U.S. Air Force and dealt with the military potential of space. The second program was run by the Central Intelligence Agency, which is better as the CIA, the Air Force, and the National Reconnaissance Office. The National Reconnaissance Office's existence was classified until the early 1930s. The program had the code name of Corona and uses orbiting satellites to spy on the Soviet Union and its partners.
A major advancement was made in the space race in 1959. In 1959, the Soviet space program was able to launch Luna 2, which is the first space probe to hit the moon. Then, in April 1961, Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet cosmonaut, was the first person to orbit Earth. He orbited Earth in a spaceship named Vostok 1. The U.S. started a program to send a man into space that was titled Project Mercury. In Project Mercury, engineers from NASA built a capsule that was both smaller and much lighter than Vostok and tested this capsule with chimpanzees. NASA had Project Mercury's last test flight in March of 1961, which occurred before the Soviet launch Gagarin. Then on May 5, Alan Shepard would become the first American in space, although he was not in orbit. Later in May, President John F. Kennedy stated that America would place a man on the moon before the decade was over.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Then, in February 1962, John Glenn was the first American to orbit Earth, and around the end of the year, NASA had started its moon landing program, which was called Project Apollo. During 1961 to 1964, NASA's budget increased around 500%. Project Apollo gained 375,000 industrial employees and university contractors and 34,000 NASA employees. However, the project faced a major setback in January 1967 when 3 astronauts were killed during a launch simulation when their spaceship caught on fire.
You picking anything up on the dials?
Hey, we got fire in the cockpit.
Hey, we got a bad fire!
While the project was progressing in the US, the Soviets' moon landing program moved slowly due to debate over whether the program was necessary and because the chief engineer of the Soviet space program, Sergei Korolev, had died in January 1966. In December 1968, Apollo 8 was launched from NASA's launch facility on Merritt Island, Florida, which became the first manned space mission to completely orbit the moon. Then on July 16, 1969, a trio of U.S. astronauts named Michael Collins, Neil Armstrong, and Edwin, or as he is better known, Buzz Aldrin, took off to space on the Apollo 11 space mission, which was the first ever moon landing attempt.
Listen, the Eagle has landed. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Later, on July 20, Armstrong became the first person to walk on the moon. His words while walking on the moon are famously remembered as, "One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." Because the United States had landed men on the moon first, they had won the space race, although some argue that the Soviet Union won because they were the first to get into space. In response to the American success, the Soviets tried to launch several spaceships to land on the moon, but the launches resulted in 4 failed attempts between 1969 to 1972. They also suffered a major launch pad explosion in July 1969. Later, in 1975, the Apollo-Soyuz mission sent 3 American astronauts into space on an Apollo spaceship that docked with a Soviet-made Soyuz vehicle. Once all of the astronauts were on board, both commanders shook hands, which was an important moment because it showed that the relationship between the US and the Soviet Union was slowly improving.